A gray hoodie, scuffed sneakers, a quiet man walking into a palace of polished steel and glass. That was all it took for the room to freeze, for every pair of eyes to silently measure him, and for one manager's subtle sneer to set a chain of events in motion that no one in that dealership could have predicted. Imagine walking into a showroom where the cars glisten like jewelry under the lights, where every detail screams luxury, but the moment you arrive, you're treated like you don't belong, simply because you don't look the part. That was exactly the test Daryl Carter had in mind when he pulled open the heavy glass doors of Prestige Motors, the newest dealership he had just acquired in Scottsdale, Arizona. But he wasn't stepping in as the boss, not yet. Today, he was simply another man in jeans and a hoodie, blending into the background, quietly waiting to see what truths would reveal themselves when appearances did all the talking. The air inside was cool and heavy with the unmistakable scent of leather and wax. The polished marble floors stretched endlessly, reflecting the rows of luxury sedans and SUVs like a mirror. Daryl slowed his steps, his eyes taking in every detail, not just of the cars, but of the staff. He noticed the way their laughter faded into uneasy silence, how smiles thinned and conversations stopped mid-sentence as soon as he entered. A woman in a fitted navy blazer broke from the pack and started toward him, heels tapping like gunfire against the tiles. Her name was Susan. The sharp arch of her brows and the clipboard clutched tightly against her chest carried more judgment than welcome. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice polite but distant, the kind of tone that carries invisible walls. Daryl gave a faint smile, his voice low, casual, as though he hadn't noticed the tension in her eyes. "Just here to look around." That answer didn't satisfy her. Her gaze dropped to his sneakers, flicked back up to his face, then landed squarely on the hoodie. "Are you shopping for a car?" she asked, as though the very idea seemed unlikely. The words were wrapped in doubt, like velvet hiding a blade. Daryl chuckled softly. "Something like that." Her smile tightened, brittle as glass. "Well, we cater to a very specific clientele here. Most of our inventory requires pre-qualification. Perhaps I could recommend something more." She didn't finish. Another employee called out her name, breaking her sentence in two, but when she turned back, her expression carried the same assumption, the kind that told him, without words, she had already decided what box to put him in. Daryl kept his voice even. "You're assuming I'm not qualified." The question seemed to rattle her just for a heartbeat before her professional mask slid back into place. "I'm trying to save you some time," she said, her tone sharpened with subtle condescension. "These vehicles start at 6 figures." He nodded, taking a few steps toward a sleek silver coupe in the center of the showroom. Its sculpted edges reflected the ceiling lights like a knife's edge. Daryl traced a finger along the handle, admiring the craftsmanship. "Nice car," he said lightly. "Perhaps when you're ready to make a serious inquiry, we can set up an appointment," Susan replied quickly. Then, with a forced smile, she added, "For now, I'll have to ask you not to touch the vehicles." Daryl stepped back, the faintest curl of amusement tugging at his lips. He had been judged before by strangers, by gatekeepers, by people who thought the clothes on his back told the whole story of his worth. Today wasn't the first time, but here, in his own dealership, the sting hit differently. "All right," he said, hands in his pockets. "Let's hear it then. What would you recommend for someone like me?" Susan blinked, her composure faltering for the briefest second before she forced a laugh. "Maybe something a little more budget-friendly," she replied. A moment later, she disappeared behind the front desk, her heels cutting through the silence like knives. When she returned, she handed him a list of used cars, old sedans, worn-out SUVs, and compact hybrids that looked out of place under the dealership's dazzling lights. "These are more accessible," she said firmly, as though she'd just done him a favor. Daryl folded the paper carefully, sliding it into his pocket. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried a weight that made Susan shift. "That's quite the assumption." She hesitated but pressed on, lowering her voice into something conspiratorial. "Prestige Motors isn't for everyone. I don't want to waste your time." Daryl's calm broke just slightly, a flicker of steel slipping into his tone. "And what exactly makes you think I'm not your target customer?" Susan didn't answer right away. Her eyes darted around, her jaw tightening. "I can tell when someone's out of their depth," she said finally, her words landing like stones. The phrase lingered in the air, its weight pressing down on the silence that followed. Out of his depth. He almost laughed at the irony, but instead he leaned in just enough to make her straighten in defense. "Honest, huh?" he said softly. I like honesty. How about this? You let me speak to the owner. Think we can make that happen? Her lips parted, eyes narrowing. The owner? That's not possible. They don't just show up here. Daryl nodded, pulling his phone from his pocket. Then maybe I'll just make the call myself. The click of his thumb against the screen was deafening in the hushed showroom. Susan froze, her confidence breaking like thin ice. Around them, a few employees pretended to work, but their eyes betrayed them, peeking up over desks and computer screens, whispering into each other's ears. Daryl raised the phone to his ear, his tone calm and measured. Yeah, it's me. I'm at the dealership. Everything's fine, just a little misunderstanding. Could you let them know I'm here? When he ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, Susan was staring at him, her jaw slack. Who did you just call? She stammered. Daryl didn't answer, not directly. He simply turned his gaze across the gleaming showroom, his reflection staring back at him from the curve of a black SUV. Guess we'll find out, he murmured. And then silence. The kind of silence that presses against your skin and makes time feel slow. Employees whispered nervously. Susan fidgeted with her clipboard, her polished image unraveling one crack at a time. And just when the tension reached its breaking point, the heavy glass doors opened. A tall man in a navy suit entered, his stride confident, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Daryl. His face broke into a wide smile. Mr. Carter, he said warmly, extending his hand. So good to see you. Susan's clipboard slipped, nearly crashing to the floor. Her breath caught in her throat as Alex, the regional director, shook Daryl's hand like he was royalty. And then Alex's next words shattered the thin walls of her denial. Ladies and gentlemen, meet the new owner of Prestige Motors. The silence that followed was deafening, but the look on Susan's face said everything. Do you think Susan deserves a second chance after the way she treated Daryl? The conference room was glass-walled, overlooking the gleaming showroom below. From where Daryl sat at the head of the long mahogany table, he could still see Susan pacing nervously, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. The staff had been summoned, sales reps, managers, even the receptionist, all filing in with stiff backs and darting eyes, whispering in low voices about the revelation they had just witnessed. Nobody could reconcile the man in the hoodie with the title Alex had announced, their new owner. Daryl leaned back in his chair, quiet, letting the silence thicken. He wanted them to squirm, to reflect, to think about the snap judgments they had made the moment he walked through those glass doors. Every pair of eyes avoided his, except Susan's, who sat directly across the table. Her polished confidence had crumbled. She looked smaller now, her voice hesitant when she finally spoke. Mr. Carter, she began, her tone carefully respectful, though laced with tremor. I want to apologize. I didn't mean to offend you. Daryl studied her, his expression unreadable. He tapped, a slow rhythm on the polished table with his fingers. Didn't mean to offend me, he repeated, his voice calm but heavy. You told me I was out of my depth. You told me these cars weren't for me, that I should settle for something more accessible. Susan flinched at her own words being repeated back to her. A couple of sales reps exchanged nervous glances, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Daryl's gaze swept the room. Now tell me, how many of you felt the same way when I walked in? The silence was brutal. A few employees looked down at their notepads. Others fiddled with pens, but not one dared to meet his eyes. Finally, a younger salesman raised his hand slightly. His voice was barely above a whisper. Honestly, I did. I assumed you weren't a serious buyer. Daryl nodded slowly, the faintest ghost of a smile crossing his lips. Thank you for your honesty. Then, turning his attention back to Susan, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. You see, this wasn't about buying a car. It was about culture, about how you treat people when you think no one's watching. That's why I came in like this. He gestured to the hoodie draped across his shoulders. Not to trick you, but to see you, the real you. A heavy pause followed. The weight of his words sank into the room like lead. Even Alex, standing in the corner with his arms crossed, looked visibly uncomfortable. Susan swallowed hard. I judged you based on appearances, she admitted. That was wrong. I know better. Daryl tilted his head. Do you? Or are you only saying that because you found out who I am? Her face reddened, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. No, She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. The truth was written all over her expression. Daryl's voice sharpened, his words cutting like glass. What if I wasn't the owner? What if I was just another man walking in here, looking for a car he's dreamed about for years? Would you have treated me with the same respect you reserve for someone in a suit? Her silence was the only answer he needed. He stood then, his presence commanding the room. From this day forward, things will change here. Prestige Motors will not be known for arrogance, for looking down on people, or for deciding who's worthy of service based on a pair of shoes. You will treat every person who walks through those doors with dignity, because respect, he said firmly, doesn't cost you a cent, and it might just earn you the loyalty of someone you least expect. The staff nodded quickly, murmuring their agreements. But Daryl wasn't finished. His eyes locked on Susan once more. As for you, the room went silent again. Susan's breath caught, her knuckles white against the edge of the table. You'll stay, Daryl said finally, surprising everyone. Not because you deserve it, but because I want you to learn. Every time someone walks through those doors, I want you to remember the day you almost embarrassed yourself out of a career. Prove to me you can do better. Prove to yourself you can be better. Relief and shame collided in her eyes, and for once, Susan had nothing to say. She simply nodded, her voice caught somewhere between gratitude and guilt. Daryl straightened, his hoodie glancing at the stunned faces around the table. Meeting's over, he said simply, and walked out, leaving a silence so thick it was almost suffocating. As he stepped back into the showroom, the sunlight caught the gleaming hood of the silver coupe he had admired earlier. He paused, running his hand along it again, this time with a small smile. Not because he wanted the car, but because he knew the real engine that needed rebuilding wasn't under any hood in this room. It was in the way people saw one another. Outside, as Daryl pushed open the glass doors and stepped into the Arizona sun, a thought crossed his mind, equal parts warning and promise. They'll never look at a man in a hoodie the same way again. A few weeks later, Prestige Motors was almost unrecognizable. The staff walked straighter, spoke warmer, and greeted every customer like family. Daryl had quietly slipped into the background, letting Alex handle the day-to-day, but he kept a close eye on the transformation. He didn't need perfection, he just needed change. And the real test came one Saturday morning. A man walked in, mid-50s, overalls stained with grease, boots scuffed from years of labor. He smelled faintly of motor oil, the kind of smell that lingers on someone who works with his hands for a living. Immediately, a few newer employees stiffened, instinctively falling back into old habits. But before anyone could whisper or gesture, Susan stepped forward. "Good morning, sir," she said brightly, her smile genuine. "Welcome to Prestige Motors. How can we help you today?" The man seemed almost startled by her warmth. I was just looking," he muttered, clearly expecting to be brushed aside. But Susan didn't budge. She walked with him toward Bate, the row of cars, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Take your time. If you see something you like, I'd be happy to answer any questions." One of the junior salesmen shot her a skeptical glance. Clearly, he didn't think this man would buy anything. Susan caught it too, and her voice sharpened just slightly. "Every customer matters," she reminded him softly but firmly. Minutes later, the man stopped in front of a dark blue SUV. He stood there quietly, just staring at it. Susan stepped up beside him. "That one's reliable," she said. "Spacious, great safety ratings. Do you want to take a look inside?" The man hesitated. His rough hands trembled slightly as he ran them across the door handle. "My daughter's starting college this fall," he admitted. "I want her to have something safe, but I didn't think I'd be taken seriously here." Susan's heart caught. A flash of memory hit her. The way she had told Daryl he wasn't serious enough for their cars. She felt a pang of shame, but also a surge of determination. "You came to the right place," she said firmly. "Let's sit inside. I'll walk you through everything. What happened next would ripple through the dealership for years." Not only did the man leave that day with the SUV for his daughter, but he also shook Susan's hand twice, his voice breaking as he said, "Thank you for treating me with respect. You don't know how rare that is." Daryl, who had been watching quietly from the mezzanine, felt a rare swell of pride. Susan caught his eye from across the showroom. For a moment, their gazes locked, not owner to employee, not judge to defendant, but as two people who had both learned something. She gave him a small nod, and this time, it wasn't out of guilt, it was gratitude. Later that night, Daryl stood outside, leaning against his car under the Arizona sunset. He thought about how easily people wrote one another off, how fragile dignity seemed to be in a world obsessed with status and appearances. But he also thought about Susan, about how someone who once embodied that arrogance had found the strength to unlearn it, and that was the real victory. Not just buying a dealership, not just teaching a lesson, but sparking a change that would outlast him. Because at the end of the day, respect isn't about titles, bank accounts, or the clothes on your back. It's about seeing the human being in front of you. Daryl smiled faintly, the desert wind brushing past him. Maybe, just maybe, Prestige Motors had finally found its true prestige. So let me ask you this. Should Susan's redemption mean she deserves a second chance? Or do you think someone who crosses that line once should never be trusted again? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us what truly matters.